over 50 small reserves since the post-independence tourism boom in Southern Africa, South Africa, have introduced elephants into relatively small areas. Begs a couple of questions. What is their impact in these areas? And this is an example of a small reserve, Venetian Limpopo Reserve, one of the De Beers mines reserves up in Limpopo province, Mopani Veld, that purchased an area of about 320 square kilometers. And the issue was it appeared to be heavily encroached. They felt it was quite a compelling argument to use elephants to control bush encroachment. There's an example from the reserve of pattern of encroachment of one of the habitats. So they put in reserves now, they put in elephants. And like the picture shows, lots of little babies. These things are rocketing away. They're doing really well. There's a little population model, projected patterns of change, and the dots are the actual realized change, and you'll see a sudden jump in the dots. Now, intriguingly, it's not just the intrinsic rate of increase. You get the elephants wandering across from Botswana. They see this, what looks like quite a cool place over the fence. They flatten the fence, they walk in, and then they push up the electrified fence again. It's easy to flatten because the electricity is on the inside. So the numbers are actually going up quicker than just breeding. So we've got a couple of questions, and this paper is part of a larger study. And in this initial paper, which is now online with biological conservation, we wanted to profile the basic sort of level of impact on things like composition, richness, diversity, and we underpin compositional changes in terms of just the abundance of individual species and on vegetation structure. These are obviously all useful descriptors of the state of vegetation of a reserve. In companion papers, we look at the demographic basis of some of these changes. But let's ask the simple question. We introduced elephants. Now, the point I want to stress, they introduced them at low density, 0.16 elephants per square kilometer. I can't go through Africa-wide figures in a talk like this. Take it from me. They've doubled over 15 or so years to 0.32. Either way, that is low density. So you've got a reserve. You've got to look at the natural variability of the reserve. Here is a map of the vegetation types. You'll see there's some large blocks of contiguous certain forms of vegetation, smaller blocks of others, some quite complex areas down in the one bottom corner. Bottom line is you've got a range of vegetation types. You've got about a relatively small area of riparian vegetation types, in other words, related to hydrological features, and a lot of dryland vegetation types, and in the dryland you can further distinguish in terms of soil types. We're in a semi-arid environment, and it's very important to interpret any ecological function in the nature of the rainfall environment when dealing with semi-arid savannas. Large fluctuations about the mean coefficient of variation, about 36%. The little red arrows indicate when sampling has taken place, and it's important to see that that first arrow in 1997, being preceded by below average rainfall conditions. It was sort of hovering around average rainfall conditions. You see the phenomenal 2000 floods. That's that event where you saw that dramatic helicopter rescue stuff in Mozambique, etc. Same event. 2002 was the next survey, and then a survey in 2010. This paper just deals with the 97 to 2010 changes. So it's summarizing the changes over the period of monitoring. Towards the end there, it has been a period of generally below average rainfall by the phenomenal flood event. So we set up 148 transects across the reserve. I won't go into the details. Suffice it to say, we're actually monitoring individual plants within defined areas. We increase the size of the transect to accommodate some more uncommon species. So you measure various parameters on the plant, including the spatial area, height, etc. So you're getting a measure of the basal area of the plant, which is ecologically a very good index of biomass, a very useful indicator of how well both an individual and a species is performing. And I've just sketched a little, what I call a spatial hierarchy of the analysis here. So you start, what is happening at a reserve level? We've got 148 transects for that. What's happening in riparian areas? 38 for that. Dryland areas, 110 transects reflecting that, good sample sizes. And for each of those, we've got a bunch of vegetation types. So I won't go into those in any detail when presenting the results, because we're here for the general story. And we look at, from the measures of each species and the dimensions, you can derive composition, and you can look at composition change between 97 and 2010 using Euclidean distance, change in species richness, Shannon-Wiener diversity, Alatolo's variation of hills, evenness ratio, and we can look at the abundance of individual species in terms of their basal area. Now, the first table here, if you skim down the probability column and you look at compositional change, one of the problems about dealing with compositional change is more unique for something not to change, because even if you've got exactly the same complement of species, some are growing faster than others, and with a decent sample size, it's likely to show up as a significant change. So this shows the obvious, that composition is changing. So it's more intriguing then to look at the underlying species. What are their trends? And without drowning in the detail, I'll try to color code this. So the red indicates species for which there is a significant decline. The black indicates species that more or less are not that different over time. And the green indicates species that have increased over time. We can't get into the details of individual species here. Suffice it to say, we are seeing overall compositional change, and it is grounded in the fact that some species are increasing, but importantly from our perspective, some species appear to be decreasing. And the obvious, it begs the obvious question, what are the agents responsible for that decrease? And you can express this then in terms of things like diversity, and we see here that there's a significant change in both species richness and in diversity for the reserve and for the two main habitats. So at all levels we are seeing a change in these basic descriptors of system organization. Again, a structural thing, if you just take it independently of species, the basal area per transect, in other words, centimeters squared of wood per meter squared of ground, we see that actually the dryland areas have increased and the riparian areas have declined, but overall the reserve is stable. So what you're seeing here is a differentiation based on habitat in the response of the system. Okay, let's get back to the beginning. So we conducted this 97 to 2010. The punchline is that a small group of elephants were introduced in the early, between 91 and 94. It would have been nice had the monitoring commenced at the time the elephants were introduced. I have no call over that. But we've got in when there was a small number of elephants right at the start. So we can start thinking about these changes as to whether they're induced by elephants or not, depending on what evidence we can come up with. But let's just carry on with the structural changes. Yeah, you're getting the representation of height classes. What the classes are don't matter here. And in fact, all I want you to do for each graph is to focus on the right-hand column, because that's the most, all I'm trying to do is illustrate that there's been some fundamental change in structure. The little stars, so you've got the 97 for, let's say, that top left reserve. You've got the 97 block of sizes on the left and the 2010 block of sizes on the right. A little asterisk above there indicates that there's been a significant change in the density of that size class between 97 and 2010. Now, all I'd like to highlight is if you consistently go through reserve, riparian, dryland, and a bunch of individual vegetation types, for which I've given examples of 3 here, consistently, the tallest trees are getting taken out. No new insight for elephant areas, but certainly well confirmed, yeah. And interestingly, this is happening. Riparian, dryland, and a bunch of individual vegetation types and reserves. So this is a very consistent finding. Tall trees get whacked by elephants. Now, what do elephants do? Just so you appreciate, you know, they show versatility in the way they whack things. You know, just a couple of pictures there. They can pull out a thing, in other words, break the main stem and it doesn't resprout. They can ring bark. Everyone's heard about ring barking. It can result in death if there's no recoppicing. They can uproot, conifers in particular. A couple show some root coppers, most die. They can slowly dismember a thing like bottom right-hand corner, the baobab. And given time, that can just not maintain itself. So and in some cases you get root coppice, like that little staculia with the clipboard there, or base coppice. So some species differ in their ability to tolerate, etc. Okay, and we can look at the phytomass loss per individual, and these graphs indicate that both for reserve, riparian, and dry land, that recent elephant, EL-1, or long-term elephant use, age elephant use on the tree, has increased markedly over time. So that's an important thing. The other important thing is that stress. The left-hand column is stress. That has also increased over time in all situations. So we've got an issue where both stress and elephant impacts have shown, left a greater imprint on these things. Debarking. In some it's decreased, but for most of those, in fact, most of those asterisks, debarking has actually decreased over time. But it is another component that has to be taken into account with this. So the evidence indicates that for the dry land, putting this all together and a level of detail you extract only from a paper, the dry land vegetation dominated by Coliphospermum bapani, very ubiquitous, very dominant, has been affected by stress but is nonetheless increasing in terms of its abundance. The riparian vegetation types and riparian overall, heavily impacted by elephant and are decreasing. Now, I just thought I'd close with a quick comment on what I thought might be of some relevance to KZN wildlife and monitoring in reserves, is that this has all been based on transect sampling. Transect sampling does not capture rare species. And a quick example of a rare species which was not represented on transects by one individual, but we census the entire population over time, and there's a perfect negative exponential decline of this weird semi-succulent bulbous plant called Adenia spinosa. And what I'm trying to infer here, if you want to examine species level responses, targeted monitoring of those individual species is the route to go rather than simply transect-based sampling. Transect-based sampling is fine for this overall descriptive picture of elephant-based impacts that I've tried to sketch for this reserve. So I feel this exercise to date has demonstrated that the introduction of elephants, because we've actually been able to quantify the impact, has resulted in simplified composition, a loss of species richness, the loss of large trees, and we've certainly shown that riparian is more heavily impacted than dry land. And to emphasize, this was under conditions of low elephant density. And the management implications, I really think we need caution about reintroducing elephants into small closed reserves or medium-sized reserves. It's 310 square k's, not big. If we want to understand plant responses, a demographic approach is needed. And for that, you really need to target uncommon species for which a transect-based approach on its own is probably insufficient. And I think that's essentially the gist of the story. And like with any story, always better off reading the paper, which is now online. Thanks.